I thought that today, since the church will be meeting the Oak Congregation will be meeting this Sunday, that maybe in this Sunday morning time we would approach it more like a Bible study. Though some of the material that I hope to go over this morning I have already gone over with some people in class, yet I think, we may not have mastered it. Galatians is one of the most interesting, intriguing books, I believe, of the New Testament. There is no other book where who the Galatians were. There was a Roman province of Galatia, but the problem is that there was also a region where native people from Galatia had actually settled. And so it's a little uncertain whether Galatians was written to that ethnic people of Galatia, or whether Paul was writing to the people that live in the Galatian province, which would include the cities of Derbe and Lystra and Iconium and Antioch. The Bible says is near Pisidia, and so those sites were in the Roman province of Galatia, but they were not ethnic Galatians. And so it's become referred to as the northern theory or the southern theory as far as Galatians, the addressees of Galatians. I would say the great number of people who work on the New Testament believe that Paul was writing to churches that he had established, that he and Barnabas had established on the first missionary journey. And so Southern Galatian theory today is a lot more, is held by a lot more people. But we shouldn't dismiss the possibility that the northern ethnic people, the people that were there that had come from the area of France and had been in that area for 200 or 300 years, but still were more ethnic Galatians than were most of the people that lived in the Roman province. It was Pompey, the great emperor, the great general, who arranged the territorial boundaries as they are in the New Testament period. So there's a problem with Galatians as far as who the Galatians are, and then there's a problem on where Paul was when he was writing, under what circumstances. There are very few things in Galatians that give us much of a timeline. There are a number of people, and I'm among them, that believe that Galatians is probably the first written of Paul's letters. The problem comes because in Galatians chapter 9, in chapter 22 again, and in chapter 26 again, Paul tells, or the Bible tells about Paul's conversion. The first instance is Luke in the third person telling about Paul's conversion to Christ. And the other two instances in Acts 22 and Acts 26, Paul tells from his perspective, from what he wants to say, his own words, tell about his conversion to Christ. And so we have three different cases in the book of Acts when Paul's conversions are related. In all three of the cases, he goes to Damascus and stays there for a time, comes back to Jerusalem, and then is sent by the church in Jerusalem back up to his home city, Tarsus in Cilicia. The chances are that it seems to me that the best evidence suggests that he was in his hometown of Damascus for maybe a period of 8 to 12 years. And we don't know anything about Paul's life during that time. He is completely, he's at the end of chapter 9, the brethren send him away to Tarsus, and then he isn't introduced back into the book of Acts until Barnabas is sent up by the apostles in Jerusalem to Antioch of Syria, one of the great cities of the Roman world. And when when Barnabas goes up there, he remembers that Paul had gone to Damascus to stay. And so he goes over to Tarsus and finds Paul, presumably in the synagogue, maybe worshiping with a church somewhere. We don't know what Paul did during that time that he was in Tarsus. Still, I have trouble believing that Paul wasn't preaching the gospel somewhere. I expect that he went out into regions of Syria, maybe as far as Damascus. That's where Saul had been converted, as you know, on the road to Damascus. And so he may have gone over into that area, or he may have gone into other areas of Cilicia and preached Christ to the people that were there. But the book of Acts tells nothing about Paul's travels or what he did. In Galatians, Paul has a peculiar problem. He and Barnabas have preached the gospel to Gentiles. So for the first time, Gentiles come into the church as Gentiles. That is, they are not required to convert to Judaism in order to become Christians. At first they were, or at least there was a strong element in the church at Jerusalem that wanted to compel Jewish converts to Christ to obey the ordinances of the law of Moses, to observe the feast days, certain meats that were unclean, and to observe the Sabbath, and for the men to be circumcised. And so there was a fairly strong element in the church, especially in Jerusalem and Judea, that required Gentiles to become Jews en route to becoming Christians. After Paul and Barnabas had established several congregations among the Greek speakers in the southern province, the southern part of the province of Galatia, then it seems to me that the best way to understand the Galatians is that some teachers from Jerusalem who believed that Gentiles had to obey the law of Moses if they were going to be Christians, that there were some Jews in Jerusalem, Jewish Christians, who followed Paul and Barnabas through the churches of southern Galatia and then into Antioch and tried to persuade Gentiles that they ought to obey the law of Moses. The 13th or the 15th chapter of Acts begins this way by saying, "Some men came down from Judea and began teaching the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." Well, obviously, they were Christians. They believed that Jesus was the Christ. But they also believed that Gentiles, in order to become Christians, had to adopt the way of Judaism. And so you became a Jew, and then you became a Christian. If these people would have had their way, then Christianity would have been another branch like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and some other sectarians of the Jews who thought of themselves both as Jews and as Pharisees. And so they said, why not also believe that one could be a Christian and a Pharisee at the same time? A Jew, a Christian, and a Pharisee, all together, depending on what he believed. Paul, of course, would have none of that. He and Barnabas believed that Gentiles should come to Christ and obey him on the same basis and in the same way that Jewish believers did. So on the day of Pentecost, we ought to understand that other than native people who were Jews came from Rome and from all other parts of the world to Jerusalem to observe the Pentecost feast. And so all of those that were obeyed, that became Christians on the day of Pentecost, and afterwards for several years, were Jewish people. They believed in the Jewish law of Moses. When Paul writes to Galatians, he is upset because Galatian Gentile Christians had listened to the people that had come from Judea, and many of them were espousing the doctrine that in order to be saved, you had to obey circumcision and other ordinances of the law. Now, Paul starts Galatians by making it very clear that he does not believe what was being practiced and taught by the Judaistic teachers. In Galatians chapter 1, in verse 11 and 12, Paul says, "For I would that you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to men. For I neither received it from men, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation from Jesus Christ." And so Paul is wanting to make it clear that his authority does not come from the elders or anybody else in Jerusalem. He had become a Christian when Christ had appeared to him on the road to Damascus. So verse 15, he says, I'm still in Galatians 1, Paul says, "For when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood." Now, he does say that he went into Arabia. There is no mention of his going into Arabia in the book of Acts after his conversion. But in Galatians, he mentions going into Arabia, and then he says 3 years later he went back to Jerusalem. Now, the question comes, Paul mentions 2 trips to Jerusalem in the book of Acts. The first was immediately after his conversion. In verse 18, "Then 3 years later I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas," and of course is Peter, "and stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any of the apostles except James, the Lord's brother." Now, this is the only mention of James as brother of the Lord that we find in the New Testament. But Paul's whole point in this first chapter of Galatians is that he did not receive his authority from the Jerusalem church or from the apostles in Jerusalem. He had a direct revelation from Jesus Christ. And so when he mentions his going up to Jerusalem, and then his second trip in chapter 2, after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem. And so apparently Paul is very careful to say that that was the second time that he had been to Jerusalem. Otherwise, you see, he would be arguing for his authority is coming from the Jerusalem church, and Paul is wanting to dismiss that out of hand. Paul has been to Jerusalem once after his conversion, and then 14 years later he went up. Now, the problem is that the book of Acts, in Acts, I'm going to skip back to some verses here, and it'll take me just a minute to reach them. But at the end of Acts 12 or Acts 11, Paul goes up to Jerusalem with Barnabas. There is no mention of Titus, but he and Barnabas go up to Jerusalem. That's in Acts 11, verses 30 and 31. Now, it seems to me that from the book of Acts is his second trip to Jerusalem, the one that he would have mentioned as a second trip in Galatians chapter 12, verse 1. Now, why is this important? Well, it is important just in terms of trying to understand where and how Paul begins his preaching after his conversion, how it happened, and the development in the early church of this Judaizing faction, a group of Christians in Jerusalem who wanted to insist that Gentiles accept the law of Moses. So that when we come across a group like we do in 2 Corinthians, chapters 10, 11, 12, 13, it's a considerable difference whether we understand the people that he's writing about there at the end of 2 Corinthians as being people who have accepted Jesus as the Christ and are trying to bind that on Gentile converts, or whether he has a different thing in mind. And so it happens in Philippians and in 2 Corinthians, as well as Galatians, that Paul is dealing with converts to Christ who want to hold on to their Judaism and want to insist that Gentiles who are converted to Christ accept the law of Moses. And that's what I think Galatians is about. It's pretty clear in the first chapter. And I believe that in chapter 2 of Galatians, 14 years later, that's the second trip that he made to Jerusalem, the one that is mentioned at the end of Acts, the 11th chapter. When Paul wrote Galatians, he had not been to Jerusalem for the conference, the Jerusalem conference, as we call it, from Acts, the 15th chapter. Well, there's a lot of complications about Galatians and how Galatians fits in with the book of Acts. And I just wanted to introduce a few of those things that haven't solved all the problems. But I believe that Paul has only been to Jerusalem twice when he writes the letter to Galatians, not 3 times. But that he does later on, after writing Galatians, he makes another trip to Jerusalem and tries to work out this thing of how Jewish Christians, what they can and cannot bind on Gentiles who come to Christ. That is, how much of Judaism they would bind on Gentile believers. Well, I hope this is of some benefit to you. I may have wandered around too much, but I've tried to take into account there's a lot of material in the book of Acts and in Galatians, and then tangentially 2 Corinthians, the last part of 2 Corinthians in particular, and Philippians, about this strong element in the early church that wanted the church to be a sect of Judaism. Now, of course, the church has rejected that. Paul rejected it. Barnabas rejected it. They said Gentiles who want to be saved in Christ can be saved on the same basis that Jews are saved, by coming to Christ and by giving obedience to him. But that the law of Moses, the ethnic qualities of the law of Moses, circumcision, the observance of certain feasts and such as that, were not ordinances that were important for Gentile believers to observe. Well, I enjoyed being with you, and I hope you can make it to worship at 10:45. But if you can't, I understand. I mean, getting out these days of this corona virus. I have trouble saying that word. But if I understand if you don't feel like you can get out. But at the same token, we have met for the last 2 weeks, and we will meet today in the church building. And so if you feel like you can come, please do. It's good to be with you today.